Hello my friends, it's Ray again over at CigarClimatology. Today we have something a little bit different in store for us today. And one of the reasons why I had originally set up this YouTube channel. Now, this is not really basically one of your typical opinion pieces that you're going to find all over YouTube and all over the internet on cigar bulletin boards. This is actual factual data that I have researched in order to gain better knowledge about storing cigars personally and building a better humidor. As some of you know, I'm active on cigar boards. Not a lot of them, but a couple. And I often find myself getting involved in these conversations, debates, arguments, etc. about the necessary steps to storing cigars. Now, again, this is not going to be a lesson or a lecture on, why you've got to buy a certain humidor or why you have to do things a certain way. That's not really the point of it. The point of, again, the recent conversation that I was involved online, and I seem to get into one of these about every 4, 6, 8 months, is that someone comes out of the woodwork and generally posts up some article from someone about what's necessary, what you need to know about proper storage conditions. And in a lot of those cases, they seem to really center around relative humidity. And that in and of itself is not a problem, because relative humidity, of course, is the major factor. Cigars are kept in proper condition by a phenomenon referred to as equilibrium adsorption or equilibrium relative humidity. And one of the things, unfortunately, that seems to always get left out of these equations is temperature. And I hear over and over and over again, temperature doesn't matter, temperature doesn't matter. I read over and over and over again, temperature doesn't matter, temperature doesn't matter. And frankly, folks, this is just simply not the case. There is a relationship between temperature and relative humidity and percent moisture content in tobacco. And that's really what we're after. In the end, it really does not matter how you achieve your specific number, your specific setting, your desired moisture content in your cigars. Moisture content is what you're after. And relative humidity and then again temperature are simply the means by which for you to achieve this percentage moisture content. Now again, rather than just sit here and lecture you about it and tell you I'm right, trust me, believe me, I've done some research on it. And I did this research a number of years ago when I really started to take a serious interest in preserving my cigar collection and building my own humidors. And so what I would like to do is I'd like to present that for you now. Now there's some caveats about this, so let's go through those kind of quickly. First off, the data that I have is not my original work. What I did is I researched this topic, and I found a number of different sources looking for the information that I was specifically interested in, and that information was what's commonly referred to as isothermal behavior for tobacco as a hygroscopic substance. And as I began to learn about this and explore it more, I began to think, well, okay, so I've seen a lot of these at one basic temperature. Well, what happens when the temperature changes? How do these charts? How does the adsorption of water into tobacco change when temperature changes? So I needed to scrap around quite a bit to get the information that I got. Like I said, this is not my original work. Where I found this information was from tobacco companies other than cigars. In other words, cigarette companies. Now you might ask, well, Ray, why did you get information about cigarette company tobacco when we're talking about cigars, and they're not really the same thing. And that's correct. You're right about that. But since tobacco is essentially one species, and there are there are certainly different plants. They are not exactly the same. Tobacco for cigarette rolling and tobacco for cigars is not virtually identical, but they're close enough for the sake of argument for this discussion. And this discussion is primarily a conceptual one, not really one that's hard and fast, designed to explain, be the end all to this discussion about Cuban cigars or Dominican cigars, Honduran cigars, etc., etc. So please keep that in mind. Next, what I did was I took some charts which were somewhere between 40 and 60 years old, and scanned them, brought them into my computer, and used them as an external reference in AutoCAD. And what I did is I drew over these charts so I could look at them digitally, and I could proportion them digitally without losing any of the original data. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the data points, and that would be great information, but I simply don't have it. All I have is basically the refined graphical data to be presented to a cigarette executive, somewhere along the line. Why would anybody want this data? And I think that's another fair question. And what's important about that is that you understand that, of course, the cigarette industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And unlike cigars, which are typically handmade items, cigarettes are largely mechanized and made in mass. And what that means is that there's a lot of money spent to make sure that the machines run correctly, that the cigars taste uniform, and they package correctly. The wrong amount of moisture inside of their tobacco could mean that a shearing machine gets jammed up and clogged, or creates chunks of tobacco where a finer chop is required, and then as that enters a filling machine, it clogs up that machine and then holds up the assembly line, or the product does not fill the cigarette correctly and there are voids in it, etc., etc. So as a very highly refined and mechanized industry, the climate control inside of the entire processing facility of cigarettes is designed around the idea that percent moisture content is what is required to make the machines run correctly. All of this basically equates to production time, efficiency, energy usage, etc. And so it's fairly refined science as far as the cigarette company is concerned. And that brings us full circle. That brings us back to our discussion here about cigars. So let's move forward. We'll move over to the computer over my shoulder here, and let's look at the chart, and I'll explain to you a little bit about what we're talking about. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for watching. So welcome back, my friends. This is actually part 2 of the video. This is where we're going to discuss some of the particulars on the chart and the actual data with regards to percent moisture content, relative humidity, and temperature. So like I said earlier, I don't want to repeat myself too much. This is the chart, and just to reiterate here quickly, like I said, this is not my original work, but this is a recreation that I made
by essentially tracing these lines in CAD and digitizing this so that I can use it for purposes such as we're using it here. Now, a lot of the circles and arrows and things are just props for me to help you follow me through. And let's just delve right into this, okay? First, let's talk a little bit about the points of relevancy here on the chart. And first would be the vertical lines. And the vertical lines,
I'm sorry, I've made a mistake here. On the chart, I called these percent moisture content lines, and these are relative humidity lines.
The next are the isothermal lines, or the curved lines on the chart. And the isothermal lines, this one represents 65, 80, 100, and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And bear in mind, I realize that you guys, you're not going to store at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, but you have to understand the spirit in which that this paper was originally authored and created. And this was based around the mechanization and production of cigarettes, and how perhaps some of these tobaccos can be heated going through machinery, etc., and how they respond in the form of percent moisture content, okay, and based on temperature and on relative humidity. So that really is, that's really the gist of it. Don't really pick it apart as far as some of the things that are not relevant to you. I get that, but the relationships are relevant, and that's really the whole point. So that's going to be the first aspect of the conversation that we're going to get into. And we're going to just pick up this little box right here, and we're going to bring it over to this little section here, so we can kind of emphasize what it is that we're talking about. Now, I've read time and time again that relative humidity is the only thing that matters with tobacco conditioning. And, as an example, you can see that, of course, based on temperature, the higher that you go in relative humidity, the higher percent moisture content will be reflected in tobacco. So if we pick a line, say 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and we go up at 50 and go to the 80 line, that represents roughly 8%, okay? Now, if we go to the 70% line and go to 80, we're going to cross all the way up here somewhere, and this is going to be probably about 15% percent moisture content. So according to the information that you already know, as you go up in relative humidity, you go up in percent moisture content. But what really is important is that you do understand that this assumes an isothermal behavior, or that what we do is we simply look or examine one temperature line to make a comparison. So that's the second part of the equation. The next really is the absolute proof that temperature does in fact make a difference. And in this case, what I'm going to do is we're just going to point to a couple of different points here. And that's this little span right here, okay? And on that span, you can see essentially that there's a differential here in percent moisture content between 9 and 8% based on 80 Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is plain as day. This is the proof in the pudding. And that is this differential spread between percent moisture content and temperature. Again, isolating or fixing a certain relative humidity. And it does the same thing along this line, okay? Whether it's 60 or 70 or 80 RH, it doesn't really matter. This spread between any two of the isothermal lines
represents vertical movement, which represents an increase in percent moisture content. And here's another interesting fact for you. As temperature decreases, now a lot of people don't find this intuitive, but it really is, and I'm not going to go into this into a lot of detail here currently, but this is something that I have professed and tried to teach people for a very long time. As you drop temperature in your humidor, assuming that you have the ability to do this, the percent moisture content in your tobacco of water actually increases. And like I said, this is the proof. If that's really all you wanted to get out of the chart, well, that's fine and dandy. You might as well just turn it off now, because the proof, that is the proof. But there are a number of other things on here which I think are relevant, and that included the actual direction under which, when you move in temperature, whether it's high or low, whether you increase or decrease percent moisture content. And like I said, we just went over that. So we're essentially done with that. One of the other things that I find really interesting here, and one of the points that, or one of the things that I really like to point out, is let's just take a quick stab at this particular point. Let's get rid of this guy. Oops. I do this all the time. Come on. All right, let's get him out of the way, and let's do something else for giggles. Let's just draw a line down here, just for the sake of argument. So if we take a look at this point, and we take a look at this spread, okay, or this spread, I'm sorry, between these 2 points, and we look a little bit at this relationship, you're going to find something really amazing. And this is one of the things that I found particularly fascinating about studying this. This line, this vertical line, represents roughly a midpoint between the 50 and the 60 RH. So for the sake of argument, let's call this 55 RH. Now, if what we do is we move from the 65 temperature line to the 80 temperature line at these two intersections, what do we see? Well, first, we see a differential in 15 degrees of temperature. Okay? So hopefully you can see that. We got to have an intersection here, and we have an intersection here. These two lines represent two different temperatures, 65 and 80. 15 degrees. Okay, so log that back in your noggin for a moment. And then if we look at the horizontal line here, which represents fixing the percent moisture content at, say, 9%, the differential between these 2 points is what? Approximately 5 RH, because we're midpoint between these two. Okay? So in this particular example, the differential temperature, which is 15 degrees, represents a 5 RH swing. So that's a really neat number. And if we take this and we divide it out, we get a very simple relationship between relative humidity, temperature, and percent moisture content. Okay? And I use this all the time, but this is essentially where I got this number, or where I get this approximation. So, to conclude in this particular discussion, it's very insightful to see that a percentage change of your percent moisture content can be attained in one of two directions, either by changing relative humidity or changing temperature. Okay? And the relationship of temperature to relative humidity is roughly this ratio of 3 to 1. So for every 3 points that you would change in temperature is roughly equivalent to 1 point in relative humidity. Again, I found this particularly fascinating, so I thought that I would share it with you. A lot of people ask me for guidelines and for numbers. You know, Ray, if I can only store at, say, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and I really like the percent moisture content, on 60 and 70, but in summertime it goes to 75. Well, what do I have to adjust my relative humidity to in order to keep the same percent moisture content? And while this is not exact science as it pertains to our cigars, it's a good estimation, and it's a way to get you close. Okay? Now, one of the other things that I found that was particularly interesting about studying this chart is that it validates another concept, in that if we fix a percent moisture content line and we say fix this number, you will see that, of course, as we go across this direction, we have 60, and then there's, say, an invisible line here for 70, and then there's another invisible line here for 75 Fahrenheit, and then there's the line here for 80, and then there's an invisible line here for 85, 90, etc., etc. And the same would be going this direction, okay? So while they're not essentially depicted on this chart, you can just imagine that there are these almost parallel lines that go between any two lines here, which represent different temperature settings. So it's easy to use this relationship and understand that when we fix the percent moisture content number, which is essentially our goal, that there isn't just one setting. It's not just, say, 65 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 RH. There's actually a number that corresponds to 60 RH as well, okay? Unfortunately, if you wish to get the same percent moisture content at 60 RH as you did at 50 RH and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, you have to bump the temperature up to this line, which is essentially 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So this gives you the relationship between all three. And when you eventually find your settings, the conditions that you happen to like, and mine just say happen to be 70 and 60, so my line is up here somewhere, okay, for the sake of argument. It's 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees. So it's going to be, say right about in this area. Okay, let's call that about 11% or 10% based on this burley tobacco example. As we move across the chart from right and left, we can find a range of settings that will satisfy that particular moisture content number. And since this one is just kind of well defined down in this area, is the reason why I've used 9% as an example. So those are the three items that I wanted to point out to you, and hopefully I didn't botch it up trying to explain it to you, because it's not really clear and easy. But if you study the chart a little bit, you'll get a handle on, and you'll get a better idea about what I'm talking about. And if you take anything away from it, remember this number or remember this ratio. And even if it's not exact to our particular type of tobacco, what we're smoking and what we're enjoying, the relationship's going to be here somewhere. And it's something that's certainly debatable, but let's say it's 2.8 to 3.8 to 1. I don't really care. The point is that you do have now a basic guideline. So as you change temperature or humidity, you can at least try to get ahead of the game by being able to estimate what other setting you need to try and maintain your particular percent moisture content. Anyway, guys, as usual, I want to thank you for watching my videos and subscribing. I hope this has been helpful to you. Till next time, adios.